right, everybody. Welcome to your next episode of Compliance Deconstructed, brought to you by Jessica Zeff, Lorie Davis, and Elvan Baker, who have agreed to come back for another round. Thank you, ladies. And our topic for today, drum roll, building and reviewing a compliance plan. And just for you listeners out there today, I am on my soapbox, so steel yourselves. This is a great topic, one that I think Lorie, Elvan, and I see quite often, this idea of a work plan. And these work plans, these compliance work plans, just seem to appear out of the ether. So just to get us started, what are we talking about, this idea of a work plan? A compliance work plan is really a document that an organization would use to set out the compliance programs or the organization's compliance priorities for the next year. What are you going to tackle? What are you going to audit? What are some of the systems you might want to put in place? Really kind of almost like a project plan. A lot of people might, that phrase might resonate a little bit better, but it's a work plan. What are you going to do in the compliance space for the next year, and who's going to do it? You may include milestones, you might include metrics, you'll probably assign particular business owners, but it's really a project plan. What are the goals and objectives of the compliance function over the course of the year? Thing is, the compliance plan doesn't just come up out of the ether. There's some underpinning processes and systems. But before we go into that, Elvan and Lorie, do you think I've described this idea of a compliance work plan accurately, or are there things you would add?
Yeah, I always think about it as my roadmap or my blueprint for the year, because it's never written in ink. It's always written in pencil with a giant eraser, knowing that things are going to come out. So for me, it's foundational. So I think you've covered it well.
So why have one? Why do we have these things?
You gotta have a plan to accomplish anything. Ideas without timelines, goals, specific check marks are daydreaming. They're not plans.
I'm going to start with because they say you have to. It is a required element by the OIG. So because you have to. But I agree with what you said, Elvan. It is you need to have a plan. Where are you going? You can't go somewhere if you don't know where you're going.
I was looking for both of those, but you expect, though. I mean, here's the thing I'm thinking. It puzzles me a little bit. You expect the plan almost from any other part of the organization. And yet the OIG specifically calls out compliance to have this work plan, to have a plan. So why is it, and we're conjecturing here, right? So why is it that the OIG called out compliance and said, hey, just like any other part of your business, you've got to have goals and objectives, and it's going to be called a work plan. And they were very specific about this because they wanted to make sure, the regulators, the government wanted to make sure that this thing we called compliance had the same stature, the place in the organization, the same resource, the same level of respect as any other part of the organization, and that it would be treated as a part of the business that had to behave almost like any other part of the business in terms of planning and getting work done. That's how much importance the OIG has given the compliance function, to actually call out, you're going to have a plan. And it's also a signal to the leadership and the board of an organization. This is how much credence we give your compliance function. We are making it mandatory for that compliance function to have a plan and a set of objectives and a roadmap for doing its work. Does that sound like a fair assessment?
Yeah. And, there's statutes that are calling it out, like the U.S. sentencing guidelines. It's also called out in the managed care guidelines for Medicare and Medicare Advantage. So if you're working in any kind of government space, it is a big component. having that work plan, having that foundation that your plan relies upon.
So just we mentioned this just to let our listeners know this isn't some small thing that is nice to have.
Correct.
This work plan, in terms of statutory requirements, gets a lot of attention and holds a lot of weight. Okay, and yet the work plan is often treated as, oh, it's just a little bit of fluff. We'll just kind of document whatever. We've got to write some policies and procedures. Maybe we'll have an audit of something or some process is broken. We'll update our code of conduct, that kind of stuff. We'll review our training. But that's not what the work plan is all about. Actually, there are layers that inform. There are things that sit behind the work plan. And that's kind of what we're going to dig into. So when I think work plan, I'm thinking, okay, well, how do I get information? Like this work plan is telling me what my risks are, what I need. If you're taking it seriously in the way that it was intended, your work plan is telling you what your risks are, what your compliance risks are, what you need to work on for the year. So how do you gather that information? Well, you certainly don't pick it up out of the air like I see so many organizations do. It requires some really careful thought. So where is that coming from? To me, it comes from, in the main, a risk assessment. You have your compliance risk assessment. You also, if you've been auditing before, or you have CAPs, corrective action plans, or a regulator has been in and done an investigation, or you're looking at the Office of the Inspector General and their work plan, you're gathering all this information, you're pulling it together, and you're saying, okay, I'm going to put this in one document and we're going to start to risk assess. We're going to look at what applies to our business. It's not a small feat. It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
So,
and just one other thing I would add is you also want to look at legislation. There might be legislation that's coming in that you're going to have to, and some of that legislation over the last couple of years has been fairly significant, that's required a lot of infrastructure, and there is risk. So I think that's another component to think about when you're planning with your work plan. Sorry, I used plan twice, but planning with your work plan. That's my phrase of the day.
So how do we do this? So let's park this idea of work plan and dig into this thing we call a risk assessment. What is going on there? So you talk about legislation and keeping an eye on what's coming up, which is an absolutely important point to make. I can't believe I didn't even mention it. But how do you do that? Like, how do you keep up? Do you have any specific tips on how you keep up?
I like to use, there's some sites out there, but I like Legiscan because it will show me all the states and where the guidance is in its life cycle, if it's been signed by a governor at the state level. And then at the federal level, again, you can get cliff notes from various sources. But sometimes it is just doing some legwork and research and making sure that you're treading water. But if you've got a state plan, maybe you've got Medicaid, or you've got your ACA in a marketplace or CHIP, your regulator will also send you guidance. And often they're sending you summaries like, hey, this is what we've sent in the last week or the last quarter. And so they're helping you to make sure that you're aware of what's going on.
And you can sign up, can't you? You can sign up for
Yes.
newsletters. And don't forget, there are trade associations. They do a lot of the legwork. So if you're a part of a trade association, or you're a part of the Healthcare Compliance Association, I'm not intending to name drop, but those of us in the field, we tend to know the HCCA. But these are all sources that can help you keep up to date. Don't ignore those. You see something new, you need to build in some time to explore how that impacts your organization. You can also listen to, I heard this wonderful podcast called Compliance Deconstructed, and they provide some really great information too. What do you think, ladies?
Yeah,
I think that's correct. Some podcasts, some newsletters. I think there is this misconception that LinkedIn is only for looking for a job and it's just some networking, but it's an amazing tool to follow some pages that puts out newsletters. There are very industry specific. Within the industry, there are some subject specific experts out there who put out information. And trust us when we say it, that people will answer you. If you have a question, go ahead and ask. Go ahead and ask,
Yeah.
someone will answer you.
Yeah.
I've seen this happen many, many times. I've put a question out myself. Hey, this is the regulation. This is how I'm interpreting it. But then I can see it the other way. And I've had enough people reach back out and says, yes, Elvan, you can interpret it that way, but here are the other parts that you maybe didn't think. So again, we're going back to that. If you have a good compliance culture where things are transparent and you're able to say, I think I know, but I'm not sure. I want to know. I want to learn. The answers will come to you.
And that needs to feed in to your work plan, but making
Yeah.
sure you understand and you have the ability to
Mhm.
get the information.
Yeah.
And
So
again,
then
it goes
we
back to
talk,
the same concept of penciling it, right? This is how I understand it today. My work plan today is based on my understanding today, and it may change. Once we try to work
absolutely.
through it, it might change.
Yes, absolutely. And that's a really great point. Like any other plan, your compliance work plan has got to be flexible. It's got to be
Mhm.
capable of, well, you, it itself. I mean, I suppose you've got to feel very comfortable understanding that your work plan may be fluid. There may be things that come up mid-year that you couldn't have foreseen when you were developing that work plan. And you've got to be able to prioritize, right?
Mhm.
Part of that is about risk assessing and coming back to that. So looking at how you get the information on new regulations. How about the OIG? I mean, what's this work plan about? I mean, if you're, I mean, I know what it is, but if you're working in the healthcare space, I'm amazed at how many folks don't know that there's an OIG work plan and that they should
Oh,
be checking the work plan. And not just that, the OIG has done a tremendous amount of work to develop work plans that are specific
Mhm.
to certain industries. So for hospitals, for physicians, for hospices. So they've really invested a lot of work to say, hey, these are the risks we are seeing in our work.
Mhm.
Make sure that you are checking these things, whether it's your documentation or it's your coding and your billing, whatever it is, the OIG is already doing some of that work for you
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
saying, here are the risks that we see. We are expecting you to be checking these risks within
Mhm.
your own organization.
Mhm.
And that's a tip too, because when they're issuing their audits or their investigations, that work plan is the basis for that. So you should be using that as it's a hint, it's a nudge, it's a, hey, this is a real issue that you should make sure you don't have any exposure to.
I know, and I don't think people realize that. It's like a cheat sheet. They're
Yeah.
literally telling you, hey, if we come knocking on your door, we may be
Mhm.
looking at these particular items. So it's a chance for you by looking at it and incorporating that into your risk assessment and then your compliance work plan. It gives you an opportunity to get ahead of the game.
Yes.
I don't know. I think it's pretty amazing. And I don't think a lot of people realize it. So
And
there's
again, much
Elvan, were
like
you going to
anything,
say
and
something?
yeah, I'm just mulling things in my head as you ladies are talking. I think that's the beauty of this. All of our discussions is that as humans, we are very narcissistic and selfish. It takes me out of my own thinking box when I listen to you ladies talk. Have you ever had a situation where, because we talk about these regulators and then there's OIG. Do you think in a company, field realizes how much they're also responsible for it?
I don't think so.
I guess no, I don't think so. I think when people work for a bigger company, I think clinicians think that they're protected by what the company does and says. And I think the the company thinks, well, yeah, I can only say so much. It's the field's responsibility to actually do it. So I think there is that mismatch of who really owns this. And again, in a company that has a good compliance culture, everybody owns this.
Yeah.
No, but it's a great point. Like, I recently had to raise that as a huge risk with an organization where actually they thought their parent company was accountable and responsible, not
I'm
realizing that when they're audited or investigated or under, from a regulatory perspective, no, they're accountable.
I'm
And
not
they
surprised.
genuinely, I was surprised, actually. The
I'm not
leadership
surprised.
seemed to recognize the issue, but everyone else, not at all.
That's actually a good note, Jess, that you really, with your compliance plan, you should have a RACI, the responsible, accountable, consulted, informed kind of chart, so that when things are going on, whether it's policy, procedure, audit, code of conduct, whatever, who's on first? Who has the ball? Who's got the ball to lead? When an audit comes in, typically it's compliance with, maybe the government relations person who's on first, but you really also need to make sure that legal's aware, and the individual business owners, like your CEO, should know that they're being audited. Even if they're not part of the audit, they should. So should the CFO and the CMO. Typically a CMO would be involved at some level, but the CEO isn't necessarily showing up for every audit. Maybe they need to, depending on what kind of audit it is, if it's external, but they should know. And you should let your business owners know when you're anticipating external audits, but also as part of your compliance plan, if you're planning to do any audits, you should talk to them. So for example, and I always pick on my friends in clinical, if they've got to do an NCQA annual review, you do not want to show up in the middle of chart chase and say, hey, it's time to do an audit. Or if they're prepping to do their annual recertification, probably not the best time to show up and be like, hey, I want 50 charts to review for accuracy. They will probably throw things at you, and
They will.
probably should. They probably should. But I think that's why you need to have that conversation so that you're aware. And it goes back to learning what your businesses owners do all day, and understanding their seasonality and their calendar so that you can plan the most effective audits timelines.
Am I a bad compliance officer if I admit I'm really bad at RACIs? Like, I see the importance of it, but I'm really bad at doing it. I have colleagues who are very clear-minded, and they're like, yeah, I see it. We can do the RACI. It's fine. And while I'm great at pulling together a risk assessment and an audit and working with the business, it seems like a small thing, but I'm really bad at the RACI. Like, I know I should do it, but I struggle to complete this table.
And I will say it's part of my background, right? I came out of operational excellence and process mapping, and I have a Six Sigma and all of that. So I think some of that it's where my brain goes. Like, my idea of a good time is a RACI and some policies and procedures and a contract and, an OpEx map. So I think not every compliance officer is that minded. But again, I think it goes back to fundamentally, you don't have to call it a RACI. Maybe you just call it your operations manual for an audit, but understanding who's on first. When policies need to get updated, who owns that? Should compliance be updating every policy? Absolutely not. But maybe compliance needs to be a part of that policy. Maybe compliance needs to just review. Sometimes your business owners will say, hey, can you take a look at this updated policy and make sure it's going to line up with that new piece of the contract or a new piece of legislation to make sure I've got it all? So I think if you lay it out, though, and you're having those recurring conversations with business owners, they'll know, oh, I need to do this. Oh, this is when I need to call Elvan.
Mhm.
This is when I need to call Jess. This is when I need to duck and hide from Lorie because she's going to come find me if I don't find her. But I think you need to have that available. And maybe it starts with that foundational policy on policies, but that should be in your work plan too.
Yes, I know. We know it sounds ridiculous to have a policy on policies. And yet, if we have to do it, guess what, folks? So do you. We share pain very equally, respectfully, but
Yes.
equally. But you guys, you've mentioned something really important, I think, in that this risk assessment and this compliance risk assessment and compliance work plan, I've seen people try and do it by themselves. And I fundamentally disagree with that approach. If your approach, your
Mhm.
focus for compliance is on collaboration and everyone's engaged and everyone's responsible for compliance, how do you identify the risks and how do you keep people engaged if you are not involving them in the risk assessment?
Yeah.
So there is an element. I've seen compliance folks sit in an office and think, I once had somebody, honestly and truly, tell me I know all the risks. And I could look him in the eye safely and say, actually, no, you don't.
You look him in the eye
But yes,
safely, you said?
he said to me, no, he said to me, I know all the risks. Why do I need a risk assessment when I know all the risks? And he identified 8 risks. 8. And some of them weren't even, none of them actually were
And
compliance
Jessica came up
related.
with 88.
No, but I just said, well, wait a minute, where did these come from? And he said, oh, I read this due diligence document from 3 years ago and I pulled it out of there. And I was like, I think we need to talk.
Yeah. But the risks also have severities, right?
Mhm.
If every house is on fire, what house do you put out first? So you need to be able you need to be able to prioritize those risks. So Jess is going to send all of the claims unprotected to a regulator. That has a certain sort of risk versus Elvan. Elvan's not going to follow the contract and just randomly start calling and contracting with providers. And Lorie is just going to tell the coding people, yeah, just pay 10% of Medicare because that's what I feel. Those all have risks, right?
Mhm.
That's not a right wrong. They all have risks. How significant is what Jess versus Elvan versus what Lorie's doing? That's how you have to think about risks. And when you build in your compliance plan, maybe you don't have the staff to do everything you want to do. So you have to think about, what can I actually accomplish in the next X duration of my compliance plan? And I always think back to that analogy. If every house is on fire, what house do you put out first? Do you put out your house, the mayor's house, the police chief, the fire department's chief? It really comes down to how you prioritize, and you may not be able to accomplish everything in a year. So you're going to, if you're a compliance department of 1 or 2, you may not be able to accomplish everything that a compliance department of 20 can accomplish. So how are you going to prioritize, and what's not going to make the cut? But Jess, it goes back to having that conversation with leadership. Hey, leadership, these are all the things I can accomplish, but more importantly, here's what we're not going to get to because we don't have the staff to do it. Do we need to reassess what we've included?
The other bit of it is you can't do that risk assessment or even address the risks on your own.
Yeah.
First of all, you can't do a proper risk assessment unless you understand how the different parts of the organization works. And the only way that you can really do that effectively is by talking to your departments and saying, what are your risks? Like, what do you perceive? That's an open air conversation. Well, what are your challenges? What are your barriers? And that's how you start that conversation. And then you might get into something a little more compliance focused. Okay, well, when were your policies and procedures last reviewed? Have you had any big system changes? I mean, what happens? Have you had a lot of staff turnover? Like those are kinds of questions. But the starter question is going in to different teams, different departments, partnering with your business owners to say, what are you seeing? How can I help? Like what's going on? And that's your data for the risk assessment. And then, Lorie, you're absolutely right. The reality is you're going to have a risk assessment, and very few organizations can address all of them. But
Yes.
what you want to be able to do is say, okay, what are the priorities? Right? What are the biggest risks to the organization? And then that feeds into the work plan. Those are, you take it to the compliance committee, it might go to the board. You agree, these are the risks. How are they going to be resourced? Who's going to partner? Because it's not up to the compliance professionals or the compliance team or the compliance officer to address the risks by themselves. It requires a team and the business partner, because you can't leave them out. It won't mean anything. You can do whatever you want as a compliance officer, but without your business partner, it's all meaningless. So there's got to be a way of bringing that engagement to the table. And all of that work then goes into the work plan. And that's then where that RACI becomes really important, or however you want to call it, that accountability, a plan of who's going to do what and when. So you get this work plan, and then that's a high level kind of document. And then you figure out the details, but with your business partners.
Yes. You have to review it with them. And then typically you want to take it to your compliance committee, to your board, to your audit committee, to your leadership to make sure that it's communicated well, everybody's aware. And again, Jess, that's where you're having that conversation. Hey, this is what we can accomplish. Do you see anything we need to reprioritize? Or is there anything we don't have in here that you were expecting to see? And that transparency, that culture of compliance really shines through with your plan.
How about when, you do your risk assessment and then you present, and your leadership wants to put very first thing to accomplish has the least amount of impact on patient care, but the most amount of impact on the bottom line? How do you have that conversation? Because you're thinking, yes, that's a part of yes, we did see that as a risk in our risk analysis, but man alive, that should not be our priority.
But maybe you have that discussion, but you have to rephrase a little bit and say, okay, well, we can do that, but we've got these other issues, and here is the risk. Here's the issue. Here's the problem. Here's what's going to happen if we don't address it. If the compliance committee, it's not usually the compliance committee, but if the board then says, we'd like to spend our resources elsewhere, remember what we talked about in our previous episode. We're advisors. We advise. So we tell you, what the expectation is. We tell you the risks of not meeting those expectations. We help you mitigate those risks. And we can even help you, come up with new processes or somehow address the issue that's of concern. We can do that. But if you as the board go, nah, thank you very much. We understand the risks. We want to pursue this other route. It's actually really hard, but it's not so simple. Like, I don't think any of us is that naive. Like, what if they're missing a very obvious regulatory issue and maybe it looks like a cover up? Maybe it's something that we'd have to report. And the other thing about compliance is nowadays, it wasn't always the case, but a couple of years ago, compliance officers have become, by regulation, we've had to become much more responsible.
Yeah.
We could be held accountable and liable for some of the failings of our organization. So that all goes into the mix. And whether, I worked with a wonderful woman who would always say, she was an attorney, and she just said, I'm not going to jail for you. I'll do a lot of things for you. And she was she would look people in the eye and she would say, okay, that's fine, but I'm not going to jail for you. So really, I think we need to rethink this.
Yeah. And the other thing is, Elvan, in your risk assessment, if you've done it, in my mind, appropriately, how much of a risk should show up on your risk assessment, that you can say, hey, understand you where you are. This is where this shook out in our assessment versus here's the 6 or 7 things we have ahead of it. What do you think we missed in the risk assessment when we talked to the business owner? And at the end of the day, if they still say, nope, that's what we're going with, you document and say, thank you very much for your feedback. I think it's document, so that if there's ever a question, you can say, yep, we had that conversation. This is the direction I was given, and I've documented that.
I do think it's a great question, though, because there are nuances there where it's not so straightforward, and it puts the compliance officer in a very difficult position. You've got the board saying one thing and maybe the compliance officer saying, hold up, wait a minute, this could be really bad. And the board's going, yeah, but we don't really think that's going to happen. And you're just one person, so we're going to make this decision. So you just never know. And compliance can be a juggle anyway. The board might be facing many different risks, not just compliance risks, right?
Yes.
So they may be juggling. We come at it from a compliance perspective, but the board is actually dealing with all different parts of the organization and juggling all of those. And we might not have that much insight. Normally we have some, because we have to know our organizations. It's the work that we do. But they're ultimately responsible for making those decisions. So I think that's a great question, and it can be tricky.
Yeah.
One thing we haven't touched on, and I think is so important, is this concept of audit, right? Like, some organizations, their compliance program isn't matured yet, right? So they might not have an audit program even, or it might be very limited, and that's being realistic. And then you have other organizations who, they have a full-on team that's separate even from compliance, and they have an auditing team. Well, that information, so if you don't have an audit program, or you have one that's very much in its infancy, that might be something to include in the work plan, to develop an audit program, even if it's one audit. Even if it's one audit, that could be a step, because that's a risk, not having an audit program. When you audit, you are essentially saying, we're just going to double check. We're going to just conduct some checks, make sure that the work we're expecting to be done is being done to the right standard. And you see that in every organization. You don't need compliance for that. It is literally quality management. That's how I see it.
Yeah.
That's another word. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say, you also want to make sure that your work plan considers any third-party contractors that you might have, because depending on your what line of business you're working in, those third parties can be considered an extension of you. So they need to have the same level of scrutiny and risk assessment and review that any other business area. So I'll pick on a random area. Let's say maybe you outsource your call center to a third party. It's not something you do in-house. You don't have that skill set. Whoever's conducting all of your outreach calls or taking your incoming calls, they need to have that same level of scrutiny. You need to be listening to a sample of calls, because depending, again, on what line of business you're in, your regulator or your state entity or whoever, they're going to want to listen to those calls too. They want to make sure they're hearing if maybe there's a script that had to be approved. Are they following that script? Are your service representatives kind and courteous? Are they doing that first call resolution tactic to try and solve the problem the first time? Are they minimizing the hold times? How long is it taking to pick up the phone? The virtual phone, or the phone, depending on what generation you are. Maybe you don't pick up an old school phone. Maybe you pick up an iPhone or an Android. But
or you
all
just
of that,
have headphones.
you just have, because it's a phone, it's a computer call. So again, if you've got a third party and you've outsourced something, make sure you're looking at those folks and make sure it's well documented. Maybe you're got vendor management or something like that, or third party risk management, where you can document and demonstrate to a regulator, hey, yeah, we looked at our third parties. We looked at those.
Yeah, and I think I've certainly worked with a lot of clients who believe they'll say to me, well, I outsourced it. I have a contract with them. Of course they're doing. And I'll say, but how do you know? And they'll go, well, what do you mean? We gave them a contract. They're responsible for it. And I'll say, no, you are.
Yeah.
Coming back to that, actually, you've signed the contract for whatever it is.
Yeah.
Whatever services you're providing when you signed up with the government to deliver Medicare or Medicaid or TRICARE or any, whatever that is, guess what? Or it could be a county contract. You've signed, a contract with the county to deliver services, whatever it is. So when you outsourced it, you're still responsible for the quality of the work. And it's something that I find people have a really difficult concept. It's hard for them to get their heads around because they genuinely believe. And I said, well, think about it in any other setting. You're a business and you want to be consistent in your delivery, whether you're in manufacturing and it's a product, or you're a service provider and you're providing services. Well, don't you do checks to make sure? Like, wouldn't you want your client experience or, your member experience or your customer experience to be positive? Well, how do you do that? How do you make sure that your business is working the way that you want it to work?
Yeah.
And that's just part of it. In any other space, you'd be monitoring your contractors. Think about any company, a builder, where it has subcontractors. Well, what happens if those subcontractors don't pull their own weight or aren't very good? How does that reflect on the contractor?
Exactly.
It doesn't
Exactly.
reflect well, and your business isn't going to last too long when you've
No.
got a plumber who can't plumb and an electrician who sets the house on fire. Like, that doesn't work.
And you're still responsible for it.
Yes.
And you're still responsible for it. That's right.
Yeah. I think about it in a non-healthcare, and it's one of my favorite analogies. If you think about the process of waste removal or garbage, right? If you put something radioactive as a business in your waste removal, you have to have a special permit, and you're responsible for what happens to that waste until it's fully consumed by the incinerating company or the removal company. So there's this handoff. So I think about my contractors the same way. I'm responsible for them. They are working on behalf of me. They are my right arm, because I'm left-handed. So they're my right arm, right? And making sure that they are doing, to your point, Jess, what's in the contract and then some. Are they meeting and exceeding my expectations? Would I want to continue to work? But your regulators depending on what line of business, you have to provide evidence and document that they're meeting or exceeding the requirements. So, and they're typically going to be part of an audit. So that should be in your work plan and you should be looking at them.
So a little disclaimer, when we were talking about waste, that was in no way a suggestion that healthcare or compliance or the organizations we work for are in any way related to waste.
I just didn't want to use the word garbage.
I'm totally teasing.
I didn't want to say garbage. I was trying to say waste removal, the nice, polite term for garbage.
It was a wonderful analogy, but I just wanted to make our listeners aware, just in case,
Very
someone
true.
might not have a sense of humor, or there might be some noise in the background that, distracts them and they only catch a part of it. Someone once did that to me. They came into the phone call in the middle of a conversation and only heard half my sentence. And then they went to my manager and then said, well, she said this. and my manager called and said, "Why did you say that?" And I said, "Well, I really didn't. There was a whole huge conversation behind there, and she only heard like 3 words of it, and not the bit where I said I wasn't in favor of doing this thing."
Yeah.
So I've always been really conscious about it. Anyway, a little bit off topic. So why do we do these things? So as we round out our episode, we've been talking about how doing this risk assessment is so important, and it feeds into the work plan and the OIG and networking and educating yourself around new regulations. And we're talking about all of this and corrective action plans. And we're talking about this because it all feeds into this thing we call a work plan that sets the agenda, the tone for what the organization, what compliance issues the organization is going to tackle for the rest of the year. And we talked a bit about what's really underpinning this thing we call a work plan. Why do we do all these things? And Lorie, you were a little bit tongue in cheek, but also serious. It is a regulatory requirement to have it. But I tend not to think of it that way. And in fact, although I know that as a compliance officer, I don't know, it feels, if I just go in and I say, well, it's a regulatory requirement and we've got to do it. I mean, actually, it's disingenuous, number one, because it's so much more than that.
Yeah.
But also people don't tend to be too interested, right? So what's the value? They're looking for the value.
Yeah.
And the reality of it, and how I genuinely see the whole process, is, as we started off when we started this episode, well, actually, it helps you to better run your business. Why wouldn't you want to understand what's coming down the pike that's going to affect your business? Like, why would you want to find out about that at the last minute? Like, why would you do that? It doesn't give you enough lead time to get the resources to do your strategic planning.
Yeah.
And that happened to me once around interoperability. I
Yeah.
joined an organization where interoperability actually affected them. We had the government, the final rule allowed for a 3-year rollout. We were already past year 1, and the organization that I was working for hadn't even heard of it. I can tell you, it was a brilliant ride. I'm going to say the 2 years were brilliant, but they were also super stressful.
Yeah.
And who wants to be in that position when it's fundamental to your business?
Yeah. The other thing is, Jess, is once you've got that plan, it's really important to, we talked about it being in pencil and being fluid, but I think it's important to capture how much progress are you making and report that out to your leadership. So, typically people think of compliance as a cost center instead of a value add, and it is both. I think very much we are a value add, but I think it's showing, hey, we had 75 things planned for the month of June. We accomplished 72, and here's why we didn't complete the 3 that we have. We moved them to July, and the business owner had an audit come up, so we didn't feel it was appropriate to do this thing, or this other thing dropped out of the sky that we needed to do, and so that's why we moved it. So I think it's important to make sure that you're capturing metrics and showing and documenting and demonstrating how successful your compliance plan is. It's your roadmap, and you want to tell people this is how well we're following our roadmap.
And it's also about demonstrating, to your point, value add.
Yes.
Well, as a result of doing this work, we uncovered maybe an additional risk no one knew about.
Yeah.
These would have been the consequences. Or by addressing this particular risk, actually, we identified a need for some process improvement. It's now much more efficient. Here's the impact. Or by addressing this, hey, we avoided a fine, or we avoided X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
Or we were better able to serve our patients or our members, or it opened up some additional resource or opportunity. So I do believe, and I'm guilty of this as well, I'll tell you, I'm very much task oriented. So once I have my risk assessment and I've incorporated this and we've agreed a work plan and it's gotten a compliance committee, I'm like, all right, let's get the job done. And to me,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that's really important to me. I know I'm getting the job done. I know I'm documenting. I know I'm working with the organization. I'm doing what I really, really love.
Yeah.
And to me, then I do find it really difficult to then sit back and be like, all right, now I've got to present this to someone else and make them understand why this is so important, what the value add is.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest, I think a lot of compliance officers and professionals really struggle with that piece. And it's not that they're not adding value, but
Agreed.
they're really focused on the doing. And
Yeah.
it can be hard to sit back and be like, okay, what am I really doing for the organization? Like, how do I demonstrate this to people who don't do this every day?
Yeah. So you pull up a nice pretty bar chart or a circle graph, something pretty, right? And it can be eye-catching. So
It can be eye-catching. I think in
or a
my head,
narrative.
so here's what I find difficult. I just say in my head, I think my thought process is, well, I'm just doing what I'm supposed to be doing. This is how a department works, and we're just getting on with our work. And it feels a bit odd to have to then showcase this work. And it makes it, in my head, I feel like I'm stating the obvious. And I feel awkward about doing that. It's hard to explain. I feel like I'm just stating the obvious. Of course, this is what we do.
But it's
When
sort
actually
of like,
it's not so obvious.
yeah, but sometimes it's sort of, when you give a speech, it's tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. I kind of think about when I report out on my compliance plan, I told you what I was going to do. I'm doing it. And here's what I told you I was going to do. So it's recapping. So I kind of think of that way. It's, I told you I was going to do 15 audits. So far, I've done 13 audits. Here's why I didn't do those 2 audits. And here's when those 2 other audits are going to happen. So I think for me, I think about it in that frame too.
That's helpful. I have to remind myself of that, actually. But I think my point is, it's like the racy. It's not as natural to me. And we all have that. Every person who works has strengths every
Yes.
person has strengths and
Yes.
weaknesses, right? And even
Agreed.
as professionals, we all have strengths and weaknesses, right? So that's not unusual. All right, folks. Another really great topic. It's one of my favorites because I genuinely, I don't know. There's so much opportunity there if you're talking about risk assessment. You don't have to do it on your own, and you shouldn't do it on your own. And it's a great way to engage with your organization and test the organization's compliance culture and kind of educate people on what compliance is and also help your organization. That is what we are there to do. We are there to help and be a
Absolutely.
colleague and a partner. And this is such a wonderful opportunity for that. For those of you who are new to compliance or don't know compliance or are wizened and aged in compliance, hope you have found our episode interesting. We'd love to hear your comments and feedback. If you've got hints, tips, things we think that we missed something or we absolutely nailed some of the topics, well, we hope that you think we nailed them all. But we'd still like that feedback if you think we did great and covered the topics really well. Please let us know. But hopefully, whoever you are listening in, you've learned something, you found the podcast to be interesting, and it resonates with you. So thank you so much for listening. And thank you, ladies, for another absolutely wonderful conversation.
Fantastic. Until next time.
Number 2.
Until next time.
See you later.
Take care. Bye-bye.